Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our distinguished guest today is David D. Newsom. Mr. Newsom's distinguished career included service as U.S. Ambassador to Libya, to Indonesia, and to the Philippines. He also served as Undersecretary of State. Most recently, he was the Cumming Professor of International Studies and Diplomacy at the University of Virginia. He's the author of numerous books, including The Imperial Mantle and The Public Dimension of Foreign Policy. Ambassador Newsom, welcome to Berkeley, or welcome back to Berkeley.
Thank you.
I should say. Where were you born and raised?
Across the bay in Richmond.
Uh-huh.
I have to stress, now being a Virginian, that it was Richmond, California.
I see. Right. You have to do a double take there when you think about that.
That's right.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your character?
Well, my father was a major influence. He was part owner of a now defunct newspaper, the Richmond Independent. And he instilled a love of writing, a love of the world beyond Richmond. And even though I didn't follow the course of journalism that he set out, I benefited greatly from much that he taught me.
And what about your mother?
Well, she was also an influence, but it's my father that I see as the strongest influence.
Was there a lot of talk about the news and politics around the dinner table?
There was a lot of talk about politics because the newspaper was the center of Contra Costa County politics, and if you know anything about Contra Costa County, it has, at least in the past, had lively politics. So I was brought up with conversations about who should we back this year as supervisor or sheriff, and I got a sense of the political realm and the essence of politics.
Do you remember any books that you read as a young person that really sort of shook you up or made you think about your future?
Well, one book I remember because it related so much to the politics that I knew growing up was The Last Hurrah, even though it was about Boston politics. And Walter Lippmann's Public Opinion had a great deal of influence on me. And then at the School of Journalism at Columbia, I had some professors that were very much into modern politics. Douglas S. Freeman, the biographer of General Lee, and Walter Pitkin, who was an interesting character. So I grew up with a lot of access to influence. Not so much on international relations until later, but on the political realm and its ways and means.
Where did you go to school? I know the answer, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Where did you do your undergraduate work?
Here at Berkeley, class of 1938.
38. And what did you major in?
English.
And what was the campus like then?
Well, it was living up to Berkeley's reputation, even in 1938. I remember a demonstration when Earl Browder, the Communist Party chief, was banned from speaking at Sather Gate.
Really?
Yes,
really, yeah.
And then I had two sons who went through Berkeley later in the 1960s, so I could see that Berkeley was maintaining its tradition of provocative politics.
So how did that education affect you and shape your future?
Well, I think there was a marvelous English department here at that time, and I think they taught me writing and discipline and the the riches of the whole vast world of literature. There was an English comprehensive exam at that time, which I think has been abandoned since, but in which you had to concentrate on Milton, Spenser, Shakespeare, and Chaucer. Now, those may all seem like dead white males, but they had much to teach us on the richness of our language and the development of character and characters.
And then after Cal, you decided, at least initially, to pursue a journalism career.
That's right.
And went to Columbia.
Yes.
And then at Columbia, you were awarded, among other things, a Pulitzer Traveling Scholarship. And tell us about what that was and what it led to.
Well, the School of Journalism has, under the Pulitzer will, 3 traveling fellowships that they award to graduates or to those that receive master's degrees. And I was lucky to get one in the summer of, or the spring of 1940. Mm-hmm. And I decided that the fellowship was really nothing more than a check for $1,500 and a requirement that we stay out of the country for 9 months. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to stretch that into going around the world. The cheapest way to go around the world at that time was on the Japanese line for $630. So I went on Japanese ships to Japan, to the Dutch East Indies, to India, East Africa, South America, just on the edges of the war that was developing at that time.
And the year again would be 39?
No,
or?
1940-41.
1940-41. So this is a moment in history when the world will be changed forever, really,
yes,
by the World War first, and then by all that emerged afterward, the Cold War and the decolonization process. Any particular things stand out in terms of what you saw, not, or ideas that emerged? For how old were you then? You were
22.
Or early 20s, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So,
well, I think that it certainly gave me a deep interest in the world beyond the Golden Gate. I saw Japan during the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Mm-hmm. Went into occupied North China. So it was my first glimpse of occupation. I saw Dutch East Indies with Dutch administrators thoroughly frightened about the growing Japanese menace. I spent 6 weeks in India. Had a chance to interview Gandhi and met with Nehru and Patel and some of the other leaders of the Indian Congress Party, and got deeply interested in what I saw as the forthcoming challenge to the European empires, which I've written about since. And then I went through South Africa, where the tension was not so much black and white as it still was English-Boer. Mm-hmm. So I saw...
Because this was before apartheid.
Before,
yes,
well, yeah, there was effective apartheid.
Yeah, but not the formal policy,
right.
Yeah.
And I went back to South Africa as Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs in 1970, 30 years later, when I saw apartheid.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk a little more about your whole sense of the importance of this imperial legacy, but I can't help asking you, anything stick out in your interview with Gandhi that made an impression beyond the fact that obviously this was a great historical figure?
I felt that I was meeting not with a deity, mm-hmm. but with one of the sharpest politicians that I would ever meet. Mm-hmm. It was interesting when I saw the film Gandhi with Ben Kingsley, that comes through in the film. I had the same impression. He had a vision of how the independence movement was going to be pursued, and how he would get there. And I was impressed.
Mm-hmm. So when you come back after this trip, I guess we can say you put aside the mantle of journalism and took up the mantle of diplomacy.
Well, I came back, and I arrived back in July of '41, and realized that we would probably be one way or another drawn into the war. So I applied and was accepted in naval intelligence, and spent most of the year in the war in the United States, but the last year in Hawaii. But then after the war, went back into journalism. My wife and I ran a weekly newspaper in Walnut Creek. But I heard about the Foreign Service examination, a special exam for veterans, and I decided to take it. Mm-hmm. And life is often turned by chance encounters with notices and opportunities, and so I've never looked back. But,
mm-hmm. So tell me, what do you think are the key elements in making for a skillful diplomat?
First of all, an understanding of politics, both our own and others. The whole concept of power, how it's achieved and how it's exercised. And secondly, a capacity to listen. And that means not just to listen to what people say, but what you think they really mean, because these are often two different things. And then to digest that sense of politics and what people are telling you into an assessment that you hope will be useful and influential in your government.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think is the best preparation for that kind of ability?
I think that the experience I had in journalism was an excellent preparation, but one has to shift one's mindset from capturing the instant moment to the longer-term view of what it means. I think history is important. Languages are useful to the extent that they introduce you to a culture, and political science in the sense of understanding political currents and power. But I would emphasize history and politics more than I would emphasize the study of cultures, although that's important.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to talk a little about foreign policy and a democracy in the media in a minute, but I can't help asking, you've had a long, distinguished career. Who stands out of the people you've worked with or interacted with as being both skillful in the politics and skillful in the diplomacy, and in a way a notch above others?
Well, although he's a controversial figure and some not always easy to get along with, I had great respect for Henry Kissinger. Mm-hmm. He is a man who had a capacity to see connections in the world in a remarkable way. You'd go in to see him with something about the Arabian Peninsula, mm-hmm. and well, what is the impact on China, or what's the impact mm-hmm. on Russia? There was an ambassador who's not terribly well known by the name of Raymond Hare, who was one of my mentors.
And how do you spell that last name?
H-A-R-E. Yeah. He was ambassador in Egypt and in some other Middle Eastern countries. But he taught me how to manage one of the most delicate links in diplomacy, which is the communication between the diplomat and his or her own government. Mm-hmm. how to understand instructions, how to determine whether Washington really intends that you carry out that instruction or hopes that you don't. These are very real skills in the diplomatic art, but it requires an understanding of Washington and its structure and its politics, and also a certain degree of courage in determining what you do and what you don't do as a diplomat abroad.
And is it the case that diplomats are obviously on a leash, but you can be creative as you pull on the leash or move in sort of subtle directions?
Yes, I think having seen the practice both as an undersecretary dealing with our missions abroad and as an ambassador, I know that sometimes Washington is very happy when an ambassador takes initiative, but that taking initiative requires a skillful understanding of how much leeway you really have in Washington. And I think one technique which I've often found useful is to, particularly if a crisis erupts, to say, I propose that we do A, B, and C, and I've made an appointment with the foreign minister for 48 hours from now, and that gives Washington an opportunity to decide, hey, back off, or good, he's got it in hand, let's not pull him in. But with the telephone and now with the computer, ambassadors are on very tight leashes, but still you're out there and you're ultimately responsible for how the relations go, and so you have to take initiative.
You've thought quite a bit about, and as been part of this process of making foreign policy, in a democracy, and not any democracy, but the United States with its history and culture. What are the main ideas that are important for understanding how it works?
I think the first understanding, or first thing to understand, that how many players there are in our democracy. I've often been critical of academic courses which seem to concentrate on the relationship between the State Department and the NSC, maybe the Defense Department, and maybe CIA, ignoring, for example, the Treasury Department, which has a big influence on foreign policy. Not fully appreciating the role of Congress. And beyond Congress, the circles of the advocacy organizations, the lobbyists, the media, all of these go into a mix which, hopefully under effective executive leadership, crystallizes into policy. But it's a very complex system.
What are the biggest changes in that system that you have witnessed over time?
First, an acceleration of the process. When I first went overseas in 1947-48, we didn't, the airplane was just coming into to being a factor, so that gradually you had secretaries of state flying to meet with their counterparts, and then heads of state meeting with their counterparts. So that sped up the communications. With the increase in the speed of communications, the media outran diplomatic communications in reporting events and also in establishing a public view of events in this country, which the State Department or the U.S. government had to confront and sometimes try to correct as more information came in and more analysis.
Mm-hmm. And who do you think has been, of our leaders or our secretaries of state, has been most effective in sort of adapting the organization of our diplomatic corps to these changes?
Well, I think that Dean Rusk in the Kennedy and later in the Johnson administrations, having come out of the foundation world, had an understanding of many of these aspects. Henry Kissinger, by the force of his personality and by his skill in dealing with the media, brought the process together. In the Carter administration, Cyrus Vance was good with the media, but the president Vance had a very effective spokesman in Harding Carter, who was able to, I won't say manipulate, but manage the process. I can't speak for later administrations, but that public face of our diplomacy has been increasingly important, and to the extent that presidents and secretaries of state can deal with that face and the creation of an image and a point of view, they can be effective.
And what about presidents? Does one stand out in your mind as kind of a shining light here with regard to leading America in the world?
Well, certainly it was a thrill to work even in a lower level in the Kennedy administration. It's, in the developing world that I dealt with mostly, Kennedy had an understanding that few of his predecessors had of the attitudes and sensitivities of this developing independent world. Reagan was interesting in that while he was an ideologue, he had an intuitive sense of politics and when to shift and adapt, and he had the public support to do that. Carter was very sincere, and I think came across effectively with a lot of people, but he was hampered by the Iran hostage crisis and others, so that his effectiveness was diminished.
You've mentioned power a lot, and understanding power as being important. But one of the other issues that must come up again and again is kind of values, you know, what emerges out of the culture. And I wonder if you would address the dilemmas of being a U.S. diplomat, where sometimes what national interest requires and the actual operation of diplomacy is a kind of a hard sell in terms of the values that we espouse, whether they're democracy, human rights, freedom, or whatever.
It is certainly one of the most difficult problems of American diplomacy, because particularly during the Cold War, but now in an age of terrorism, we have similar problems. There are those we have to work with who are the antithesis of everything we believe in. I think the key is to, I have seen a number of revolutions where our close identity with an unpopular and oppressive ruler has resulted in when that ruler is overthrown, our interests are overthrown with it. And the most important objective, I think, in our diplomacy is to work with such people where our national interests require it, but do everything we can to avoid such a close identity so that the people in the country see our interests and our identity identical with that of an unpopular ruler. Mm-hmm. It's not easy, but one can do it by, an ambassador can do it by gestures, by statements which don't necessarily contradict what Washington is saying, but which say to people in a culture that you understand, I understand you, this is what we face, but it's in your interest to understand us and work with us. It's a nice path to.
And I think President Johnson would call this having your ears to the ground, basically, or pressing the flesh, maybe a better way to say it. So
well, ears to the ground, I think, is
better.
Yeah,
is better. Now, one of your books is called The Imperial Mantle. And I think it reflects what became a major interest in your work, which is relations with the Third World. And you had a number of important ambassadorships to Indonesia, to Libya, among others. And so, and I get the sense, and it's included in the introduction to the book, that this trip that you took as a young person just out of school really impacted the way you saw the world and really helped guide you in your understanding of our relations with the Third World as you became an American diplomat. Talk a little about that.
Well, my career, really beginning with that trip, paralleled the breakup of the major European empires, and I had the good fortune to witness it beginning in Karachi right after the partition of India and ending up in our own former colony, the Philippines. Beginning with that trip, but even more in the diplomatic missions that I had, I realized that the world was going through a tremendous transformation. The lives of billions of people were being changed. And I never had the feeling that the magnitude of that was fully appreciated in the United States. And our own position with respect to it was ambivalent, because while we professed, having been a former colony ourselves, that we understood these people, we didn't really understand what was going on, because our revolution was against people of our own race. We were establishing a rich, independent country, but the revolutions of the 20th century were against people of a different race, and often led to severe economic problems. So the decolonization revolution was totally different from ours, and we never fully accepted that, and our rhetoric often made people in the newly independent countries expect things from us which we weren't able to deliver. And I think that's part of our problem still.
And is there a particular case that you can cite that of a mission you had or a problem you had to deal with where this really hit home to you?
In general, one of my frequent complaints is that when you come back to Washington and you'll get a question of, well, why doesn't ruler X or country X do what we want him to do? And you try to say, well, he's got a political problem. And you get from some people in our country, well, that's too bad, that's his problem. And you get the feeling that a country that is so alive to politics doesn't really understand or take the trouble to understand that other people have political pressures which constrain their choices. In Libya, before the Gaddafi revolution, we had an air base, Wheelus Air Base. In the 1967 war, although Libya, the Arab-Israeli war, Libya wasn't a combatant, it felt very keenly about the Arab cause. And the air base became a very sensitive issue. I was fortunately given considerable discretion, including the discretion to close down the base for several weeks until the heat had passed over, because I understood the political problems that the king was facing, and was able to persuade Washington of that fact.
Let's talk a little about some of our current relations, and I'm wondering if you could help us bringing this experience that you have, these ideas about what we haven't understood about the world, and just tick off some of the countries and have you sort of comment along the lines of, well, if we're going to deal with this issue, these are the kinds of things that we need to think about. Israel would be an example.
Well, you talk about Israel in the context of its relations with the Palestinians and with the rest of the Arab world. Israel is a unique case because it's a country in which there is tremendous interest and support within the United States, which often limits what we can do
as diplomats.
As diplomats,
right?
And I think an American diplomat in the Arab world must do his or her best to explain the political circumstances and emotions and interests in the United States, but hoping at the same time that whatever administration is in power will understand that this is an issue of deep emotion in the Arab world, where we have major interests. And I think every administration, including this administration, has tried, and often with great anguish, to balance this. I think one thing that comes up now in that the Bush administration is discovering is how the past limits our ability and to do everything that we want to do, particularly in the developing world. And so in a country like Jordan, for example, where we consider it a friendly, supportive country, how the degree of cooperation we can get from the Jordanian government has to be prefaced or understood in the light of Jordan's close association with the Palestinians, the intense feeling in many Arab countries about the existence of Israel. And so our diplomacy is constantly a balancing act between what we see it in our interest to do and what it is really conceivable that other countries can do without themselves suddenly being in peril. So.
Let's name another country. What about Saudi Arabia? Do you see that relationship changing a lot now, or are the issues we're hearing about, have they been present, over this whole period that we're talking about?
I think the Saudis themselves have a dilemma. They have recognized for many years the importance to the United States, of the United States, to their security, to their economy. But for decades, the primary concern of Saudi rulers has been the preservation of the Saudi family and the Saudi rule. And so I think you've seen in recent days Saudi efforts to preserve that link with the United States by taking a positive, what they see as a positive step in the Abdullah plan, a rather courageous step from the standpoint of Saudi politics, and then hoping desperately that the reaction of the United States will give them a degree of support in the Arab world that will balance these interests.
What about Pakistan?
Well, Pakistan is a country that has, ever since partition, has had trouble establishing itself. You remember it lost East Pakistan, and it has 4 provinces in West Pakistan that have different characteristics and require a certain amount of juggling. And then all of this has been overshadowed by the Kashmir problem, which began when I was in Pakistan in 1948.
Did you go to Kashmir at that time?
No, we in Pakistan were not encouraged to go to Kashmir at that time. But when we got together with our friends from the embassy in New Delhi, it used to sound like an inter-dominion conference. We were arguing about the Kashmir question. And there's so many parallels between the Kashmir problem and the Israeli-Palestinian problem in the sense of infiltration and the question of who stimulates the infiltration. Is it a natural outgrowth of the oppression of an occupying power, or can it be controlled? And Pakistan is, of course, a country where we have had to balance in spades our interests with relations with rulers that we've not particularly liked to endorse.
You know, in your book, you obviously emphasize history a lot and the legacy of imperialism, and that clearly is involved in that conflict. But I'm curious about the legacy of our own policies, you know, in that area. And one of the, as we move into this 9/11 era, you know, thinking about the world in light of the tragedy at the World Trade Center and the acts by Osama bin Laden, the extent to which some of our policies in an earlier period, that is supporting the Mujahideen, opposing the Soviet Union, that in a way some of the history we're seeing in that area is a result of those policies. Comment on that. Do you accept that, or how should we think about that?
Well, certainly our support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which seemed necessary and logical at the time, comes under the head of the law of unintended consequences, now coming back to haunt us. But if there's a legacy of affecting the United States in the developing world or the third world, it comes out of a belief that I think grew out of the imperial age, that somebody else is always manipulating their politics. That I was in Baghdad during the royal regime, and people used to argue when a new cabinet list came out of the King's Palace, did this come out of the American embassy or did it come out of the British embassy? And I think still today in much of that part of the world there is a feeling that we are not really responsible for much of our problems and our disasters because the imperial presence is still manipulating us, and that imperial presence is now the United States. I was once down in the desert in Libya talking to a sheikh down there when I was accosted about the American responsibility for the Crusades. I had to explain a little bit of history, but there is this belief that we suffer from, that we have a capacity to shape events if we just wanted to, and if we don't shape them, it's because we have some malevolent desire not to shape them. So
what you're suggesting is there's a historical legacy which marries itself to the obvious power we have in the world, which then leads to an apparent equation. This was caused by that, which may not be the case, but that is actually in people's minds.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's why I entitled my book "The Imperial Mantle," because I think we have, in the minds of a great many people, we have assumed that mantle. In Iran, where we have special problems, part of the problem still arises from a belief that we were manipulating their politics in the time of the Shah, and if they reestablish relations with us, that manipulation is going to begin again. Just one example of that: when the hostages were seized in November of 1978, we wanted to send an emissary to talk to the Iranian authorities, the post-revolutionary authorities. We sent an emissary as far as Istanbul, and then we were going to get an American military plane to take him the rest of the way. The Iranian Foreign Ministry said, we don't want any American planes landing in Iran because you'll send in counter-revolutionaries with them. And so there's this belief that we're constantly trying to overthrow the revolution.
With your understanding of this history of the region and of your understanding of American politics and the way we make foreign policy, do you see any obstacles that stand out as we adjust to this new war against terrorism? Where do you think the problems lie for us?
I think there's always going to be a continuing problem of the ability of our diplomats to explain the politics of a strange foreign society and the limitations of a foreign ruler in cooperating with us in such a thing as the war on terrorism. And I think the executive leadership may come to understand that, but then it needs to be explained to members of Congress. And one of the problems that the United States is often faced is that there are many voices who speak to both our leadership and our members of Congress. And they can those who don't really want to accept the way politics may be portrayed by the State Department can find somebody else who will say, well, they don't know what they're talking about.
So you're talking about the politics in the particular state.
That's right.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, but that affects American politics because a lobbyist, I mean, the degree to which foreign countries lobby the Congress, and not just lobbyists for a country, but for exile groups. Iraq is a perfect example of that, where you have an exile group that has close ties with members of Congress who are trying to convince members of Congress that getting rid of Saddam Hussein would be a pushover, whereas people in the Department of State and I think Defense and others see the obstacles in much more complex terms, but the politics of the Iraq question is very much affected by the different voices that play upon the Washington scene.
So in a way you're saying there's intelligence and there's intelligence.
That's right.
Basically,
yes.
and that we have to, it's not just the facts, but the dance within which the facts play themselves out.
When we were trying to deal with the Iranian Revolution before the Shah was overthrown, we had the problem of a very effective Iranian ambassador in Washington who was saying, in effect, the Shah is strong, don't worry about him, the State Department is just panicking, and yet all of the indications were that all the support for this man was eroding. But dealing with the U.S. politics of it, we were dealing with multiple voices, contrary voices.
How much do you think the world has changed with regard to the fact that it's not just state-to-state relations that are so important, but all these manifestations such as non-governmental organizations and so on.
The non-state actors and their growing power, it's not a new phenomenon because all through the decolonization period you had the liberation movements, which were basically non-state actors, which had their lobbyists in Washington. But Al-Qaeda is a dramatic and unwanted extension of the power of non-state actors.
My sense after reading your books and talking with you is that you really don't buy the argument of Huntington of a clash of civilizations, for example, between us and the Arab world or the Islamic world.
No, religion is a factor because religion also is a factor of identity. And when identity is challenged, people react. But I think if there's a division in the world, it's much more a division in the economic status of peoples, their historical backgrounds. There's still something of a division in the world between the former colonial countries and the industrialized countries, but the that varies so much with individual countries in the developing world that you can't say that there is a clash.
If students sought your advice about how to prepare for the future, what would your thoughts be?
How to prepare themselves for
the future,
a career future?
Yeah, I mean, not just how they should prepare to think about the world in order to engage it, really, in whatever field they're in.
Well, I would advise any student, whatever the profession going into this century, to set aside some time to read about and understand the world beyond our shores, because that world is going to continually impinge upon whatever we do. And we are an insular people, and we have a tendency to dismiss foreign societies as strange and difficult to comprehend. So I would say that to the extent that they can encourage in their universities studies of international relations and the world beyond our shores, whether they're in engineering or medicine or whatever, it's going to be to their advantage in the future.
I get the sense in reflecting back on your life that was some trip you took after you graduated, and something that both changed your life and made you understand the world better.
Well, it certainly made me more interested in the world.
Ambassador Newsom, on that note, I want to thank you very much for being with us today and reflecting on your life and your work. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.